The morning of August 19, 1944, dawned with a deceptive sense of normality over the battle-scarred landscape of Normandy. For the pilots of the Allied Tactical Air Forces, it was another day in the great, grinding machine of war. Their mission: maintain the aerial stranglehold on the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army, now desperately trying to escape eastward from the closing Allied pincers. The Falaise Pocket was nearly sealed, and the air was thick with the promise of a decisive victory. But on this particular morning, no one yet knew the scale of the slaughter that was about to unfold. It would begin not with a thunderous bombardment, but with the quiet, methodical work of a lone reconnaissance pilot, his eyes scanning the ground from the cockpit of a nimble, unarmed aircraft. The pilot, part of a Royal Air Force or U.S. Army Air Force's photorecon squadron, was tasked with a routine mission. His job was to fly over the suspected German escape routes east of the town of Falaise and south of Trun, looking for signs of movement, concentrations of troops, and, most importantly, the location of the elusive gap through which the Germans were still fleeing. He flew in a specialized aircraft, perhaps a Spitfire PR Mk-11 or AP-51 configured for reconnaissance, stripped of weapons to carry extra fuel and cameras. His defense was his speed and his altitude. His weapon was his camera, a sophisticated piece of optics capable of capturing stunning detail from thousands of feet in the air. As his aircraft droned over the designated sector, the pilot would have seen the familiar, grim tapestry of the Normandy battlefield, shell-pocked fields, burning villages, and the occasional black smoke plume of a knocked-out vehicle. But then, his trained eye would have caught something different. On the roads below, particularly the D13 and D14 leading towards the crossing points over the river dives near the village of St. Lambert-sur-Dives, there was not the scattered, hurried movement of a defeated army in disorganized retreat. What he saw was something far more significant, far more tantalizing. It was a traffic jam of apocalyptic proportions. Through his canopy, he saw a scene of almost surreal congestion. The narrow country lanes, designed for farm carts and local traffic, were choked with a stationary and slow-moving column of military hardware stretching for miles. There were horse-drawn wagons alongside the most advanced German armor. There were staff cars, half-tracks, and thousands of troops on foot, all funneled into a deadly bottleneck. The geography had become a trap. To the north were the advancing British and Canadians. To the south were the Americans. And to the east, the only route to safety was a handful of small bridges and fords across the Dives River. The entire fighting retreat of two German armies was compressing itself into a few square miles of French countryside, and from the air, it looked like a shooting gallery. The pilot's heart would have raced. This was not just a target, this was the target. He would have banked his aircraft, ensuring the cameras in their fuselage bays were activated. The low hum of the camera motors would have begun as he made his first pass, the lenses capturing a panoramic, detailed record of the chaos below. He flew the length of the column, his shadow flitting over the unsuspecting troops. He noted the key choke points, the bridges at St. Lambert, the crossroads at Moissy, the sunken lanes that acted as natural corrals. He saw the perfect, vulnerable clustering of vehicles, fuel trucks parked next to ammunition carriers, tanks immobilized for lack of fuel, and a mass of humanity caught in the open. The German troops on the ground would have heard the high-altitude drone of the reconnaissance plane. To them, it was an ominous sound, but one they had grown accustomed to. They had learned to fear the fighter bombers, the J-bows, not the high-flying, unarmed photobirds. They may have fired a few desultory bursts of flak, but the aircraft was likely too high and too fast for their small arms. In their desperate focus on escaping the tightening noose on the ground, they failed to realize that the most immediate and deadly threat was the one silently photographing them from above. That lone pilot, in his unarmed plane, had just signed their death warrant. Their mission completed, the reconnaissance pilot turned for home, the precious film rolls in his camera magazines holding the key to unleashing hell. The flight back to his base in England or a forward airfield in France would have been filled with a tense anticipation. He knew what he had seen. He knew the intelligence value of his photographs was incalculable. Upon landing, the routine ended. The film was rushed to the processing tent, where technicians carefully developed the negatives. The wet prints were then analyzed by photo interpreters, men skilled in reading the story of war from the shadows and shapes on a glossy piece of paper. Their analysis would have been swift and electrifying. Using stereoscopic viewers, they could discern the types of vehicles, estimate the number of troops, and identify the most critical points in the column. They would have marked the locations of fuel tankers, prime targets for ignition, and the clusters of tanks and armored vehicles. A report was drafted, a map was overlaid with targets, and the information was immediately relayed to the headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Air Force. The quiet, methodical work of the reconnaissance pilot was over. The discovery was made. The stage was set. The order was about to be given, and their hunters were being called to the feast. The 15 minutes of hell were now inevitable. The German convoy, so devastatingly revealed from the air, was not merely lost. It was the living, bleeding heart of an army caught in the final, fatal stages of a strategic collapse. To understand the scale of the disaster about to unfold, one must comprehend the geographic and military vice that had been methodically constructed around it. This was the Falaise Pocket, or as it was more accurately known, the Falaise Gap. The name itself is a misnomer, suggesting an opening. In reality, by August 19, 1944, it was a rapidly closing corridor of escape, and the convoy on the roads near St. Lambert-sur-Dives was caught directly in its narrowing throat. They were trapped between the hammer and the anvil. The anvil had been forged to the north and west. For over 2 months, since the landings of D-Day, the British and Canadian armies of General Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group had been engaged in a brutal, grinding battle of attrition against the bulk of Germany's armored reserves. Operations like Goodwood and Atlantic, while costly, had pinned down and bled the German panzer divisions. Now, the British Second Army and the 1st Canadian Army were pressing southward from the towns of Falaise and Tron. Their advance was the anvil, a solid, unyielding wall of men and steel against which the retreating German forces would be smashed. They were methodically sealing the top of the bottle. The hammer was falling from the south and west. This was the American spearhead, the embodiment of the Allied breakout from the Normandy blockage. General George S. Patton's Third Army had erupted onto the scene with breathtaking speed, its columns racing east and then north in a wide, sweeping envelopment. While part of his force dashed towards the Seine, the 15th Corps, under General Wade Hayslip, drove northward towards the town of Argentan. Their mission was to link up with the Canadians pushing south from Falaise, thereby completely encircling the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army. Patton's forces were the hammer, a mobile, aggressive force designed to slam the trap shut with overwhelming force. Between this hammer and anvil lay the only remaining escape route, a perilously narrow corridor, at some points less than 2 miles wide, running eastward between the towns of Tron and Chamboy, and crossing the river Dives. This was their gap. Through this tiny, constricted passage, the entire shattered might of 2 German armies was attempting to flee. The scene on the ground was one of apocalyptic chaos. This was no orderly retreat. It was a rout, a disintegration. Discipline, the very glue that held the Wehrmacht together, was dissolving under the immense pressure of imminent annihilation. The roads leading to the gap were a hellish tapestry of despair. They were clogged with a macabre procession of the broken war machine. Elite Waffen-SS Panzer Grenadiers, who had fought with fanatical determination for weeks, now trudged alongside conscripted infantry from across Europe. Panzer IVs and the feared Panther and Tiger tanks, low on fuel and ammunition, were either abandoned where they ran dry or became immobile, steel islands in a river of fleeing humanity. Horse-drawn carts, the backbone of German logistics, were tangled with trucks, staff cars, and half-tracks. The air was thick with the smells of diesel, sweat, and fear. The sounds were a cacophony of shouted orders, often ignored, engine whines, the cries of the wounded, and the ever-present, distant thunder of artillery. Command and control had evaporated. Generals were cut off from their divisions. Radio communication was spotty at best. Units were hopelessly intermingled. A battalion from the 2nd Panzer Division might find itself sharing a ditch with a regiment from the 84th Infantry Corps. There was no front line. The front was everywhere and nowhere. Allied fighter bombers, though not yet unleashed in their full, concentrated fury, constantly harried the edges of the column, picking off vehicles at the periphery and adding to the congestion and terror. Every soldier, from the lowliest private to the most hardened officer, knew they were in a race for their lives. The only goal was to get across the Dives River and onto the open roads leading to the Seine. But the geography conspired against them. The roads themselves were narrow, sunken lanes, bordered by high hedgerows that had proven so defensively useful to the Germans weeks earlier. Now, these same hedgerows became walls of a deadly maze, preventing vehicles from dispersing off the road when attacked. A single knocked-out truck or tank could block the entire passage for hours, creating a fatal backlog. The few bridges over the Dives became precious bottlenecks, where men and machines compressed into dense, panicked crowds, desperate to cross. It was at these very points, the bridges, the crossroads, the sunken lanes, that the reconnaissance pilot had seen the most lucrative targets. By August 19, the jaws of the Allied pincer were almost touching. Polish armored units, fighting with a special fury as they closed in on the Germans who had destroyed their homeland, had seized the vital Mczuger, Mace, Hill position, dominating the escape routes from the north. American infantry from the 90th Division were pushing in from the south. The corridor was not yet completely sealed, but it was suffocatingly tight. The German convoy was not just moving through a dangerous area, it was stationary and slow-moving prey, compressed into the killing zone by the irresistible pressure of the hammer and the anvil. They were an army in its death throes, physically and psychologically exhausted, their escape route reduced to a few vulnerable threads. They were perfectly, tragically positioned for the blow that was already, from the air, being prepared. The stage was set not for a battle, but for an execution. The intelligence from the photo-reconnaissance pilot did not simply land on a desk, it detonated within the command structure of the Allied Expeditionary Air Force. The grainy black and white photographs were not just images, they were a hunting license, revealing the most concentrated, vulnerable target of the entire Normandy campaign. In the operations rooms, a sense of electrified urgency took hold. This was the opportunity they had been waiting for, the chance to not just harass the retreating enemy, but to annihilate him in the open. The order went out, a clarion call to every available squadron within range. Their hunting pack was being assembled, and it was an armada of unprecedented size and fury, drawn from the combined air power of the British 2nd Tactical Air Force and the US 9th Air Force. The backbone of this aerial killing force was the Hawker Typhoon. To the German soldier, it was the Jabot, the fighter bomber, a name spoken with a unique dread. The Typhoon was not a graceful dogfighter, it was a brute, a thick-set, powerful ground attack aircraft built around a monstrous Napier Sabre engine. Its primary weapon for this kind of work was not its cannons, but its batteries of RP-3, rocket projectile 3-inch, anti-ground rockets. Each Typhoon could carry 8 of these 60-pound warheads. A single rocket could destroy a tank, a salvo from a squadron could obliterate an entire grid square. The rockets were inaccurate by modern standards, but against the densely packed, stationary target of the Falaise convoy, precision was unnecessary. It was an area weapon, and the area was teeming with targets. Alongside the rocket-firing Typhoons were the fighter-bomber variants of the P-47 Thunderbolt. Their Jug, as it was affectionately known by its American pilots, was another heavyweight brawler, renowned for its ability to absorb phenomenal punishment and still return home. Its primary armament for ground attack was a combination of .50 caliber machine gun fire, bombs, and, like the Typhoon, rockets. The 8.50 caliber guns of the P-47 created a converging cone of fire that could saw a truck in half or shred any exposed personnel. Flying in at treetop level, the Thunderbolt pilots would strafe the length of the column, their bullets walking through vehicles and men with devastating effect. But the armada was not limited to these two types. They were joined by a host of other aircraft, each with a specialized role in the coming slaughter. North American P-51 Mustangs, the premier long-range escorts, now free from their bomber escort duties, were tasked with establishing air superiority over the kill zone. Their job was to circle high above, a protective screen against any last-ditch effort by the Luftwaffe to interfere. They would pounce on any German fighter foolish enough to venture near, ensuring the fighter bombers could work unmolested. Meanwhile, medium bombers like the Martin B-26 Marauder and the Douglas A-20 Havoc were called in to deliver a different kind of punishment. They flew at medium altitude, their bomb bays opening to saturate larger areas with high explosive bombs, churning the earth and destroying any semblance of cover or organization on the ground. The process of assembling this force was a masterpiece of Allied coordination and logistics. The signal went out from headquarters to airfields scattered across southern England and the recently secured airfields in Normandy. On these fields, a controlled frenzy erupted. Ground crews, the unsung heroes of air power, worked at a breakneck pace. They swarmed over the Typhoons and Thunderbolts, loading rocket rails, belting .50 caliber ammunition, and fusing bombs. Fuel bowsers moved from plane to plane, filling the tanks to the brim for long loiter times over the target. Pilots, who had been resting or playing cards, were scrambled to their briefing huts. In the briefings, the mood was a mixture of intense focus and grim anticipation. The intelligence officers would unveil the large-scale maps, with the convoy route clearly marked. They pointed out the key choke points identified by the photo interpreters, the bridges, the specific crossroads, the sunken lanes where the vehicles were most densely packed. The pilots were given their assigned sectors and attack vectors. The instructions were simple and brutal: make pass after pass until you are out of ammunition or fuel. Do not let up. The goal was not merely to inflict casualties, it was to create a state of absolute paralysis and destruction, to turn the escape corridor into a tomb. One after another, the squadrons took to the air. The sound was deafening as the Sabre and Pratt and Whitney radial engines coughed to life, then roared at full power. The aircraft taxied, formed up into their attack formations, and then climbed away, turning southeast towards the French coast. The sky filled with them, not just a few flights, but a continuous stream of aircraft, a winged armada moving with a single, terrible purpose. They flew over the Allied lines, where soldiers on the ground looked up and saw the awesome spectacle of their own air power, a dark cloud of vengeance moving towards the enemy. As the first waves approached the target area, the radio channels would have grown quiet, the banter of the pilots replaced by a professional calm. They would have seen it long before they reached it, a vast, dark stain on the landscape, a tangled, unmoving snake of men and machines. And then, the order would come. Their hunting pack was assembled. The prey was sighted. The 15 minutes of hell were about to begin. The first sound was not an explosion, but a growing, menacing roar that descended from the western sky. For the German soldiers trapped in the convoy, it was a sound they had learned to dread above all others, the deep, thunderous drone of Napier Sabre engines at full throttle. Looking up, they would have seen the first wave of Hawker Typhoons, appearing as sleek, dark shapes against the sun, already nosing over into their attack dives. This was the moment the reconnaissance photos and the briefing room maps became terrifying reality. Their hunt was on. The Typhoons, the vanguard of the Allied aerial armada, were entering the kill zone, and they were coming to deliver a new kind of warfare, annihilation from the sky. The Typhoon pilots, having held their formation during the flight in, now broke into their attack runs. The drill was methodical, practiced 100 times on training ranges and in previous, smaller-scale attacks. But none had ever seen a target like this. The ground below was a tapestry of chaos, but from the air, it was a perfectly defined shooting gallery. The lead pilots picked their initial points of aim, not individual vehicles, but entire sections of the congested column. A fuel tanker surrounded by trucks. A cluster of armored vehicles trapped in a sunken lane. A mass of infantry scrambling for cover that did not exist. The sheer density of targets was overwhelming, it was impossible to miss. The attack began with the rockets. From an altitude of around 1,500 to 2,000 feet, the pilots would stabilize their aircraft, their thumbs hovering over the firing button on the control stick. A typical attack run lasted mere seconds. On command, or as their sight picture aligned, they would unleash their full salvo. The sound was unforgettable, a deafening, ripping whoosh as 8 RP-3 rockets streaked away from their underwing rails in quick succession, leaving trails of gray smoke. The rockets fanned out slightly as they raced towards the earth, their 60-pound high-explosive or armor-piercing warheads covering a wide area. The impact was cataclysmic. The first rocket slammed into the convoy with the force of a localized earthquake. A direct hit on an ammunition truck would trigger a secondary explosion that vaporized everything within a 50-yard radius, sending a fireball rolling into the sky and scattering shrapnel and debris across a wide area. A strike among a cluster of tanks might not penetrate their top armor, but the blast could blow off tracks, shred external equipment, and stun or kill the crew inside through sheer concussive force. Against soft-skinned vehicles, the trucks, staff cars, and horse-drawn wagons that made up the bulk of the convoy, the rockets were utterly devastating, tearing them into shredded metal and splintered wood. The initial salvos were designed to cause maximum chaos and destruction, to break the back of any organized resistance and create fires that would act as beacons for the following waves. Immediately after firing their rockets, the Typhoon pilots did not break away. They continued their steep dive, now aiming the nose of their aircraft directly at the chaos they had just created. Their 420mm Hispano cannons, housed in the wings, now came to life. As they plummeted to within a few hundred feet of the ground, they pressed the trigger. The cannons fired with a sound like tearing canvas, a deep, percussive brrrrp that could be heard even over the explosions and the engine roar. The high-explosive cannon shells walked through the shattered remnants of the column, stitching a line of destruction. They hammered into vehicles that had survived the rocket strike, ripped apart groups of soldiers who had abandoned their machines, and sparked new fires among the wreckage. The psychological effect on the German troops was beyond calculation. There was no defense. The flak guns that might have offered some resistance were either out of ammunition, bogged down in the traffic jam, or had their crews killed in the initial onslaught. The attack came from every direction as successive waves of Typhoons circled the area, each pilot selecting his own target. Men who had survived the Eastern Front described the Falaise Gap as a far greater horror. There was no front line to hold, no enemy position to assault. The enemy was the sky itself. The only options were to flee into the open fields, where they were cut down by cannon fire, or to hide under or behind their vehicles, which were themselves becoming tombs as rockets and cannon shells found them. The Typhoons made pass after pass. Once their rockets and most of their cannon ammunition were expended, they would climb away, their engines straining as they turned back towards their bases to rearm and refuel. But there was no respite for those on the ground. As one wave departed, the next was already entering the kill zone, their own rockets streaking down to renew the storm of steel and fire. The air grew thick with the smell of cordite, burning gasoline, and scorched metal. The roads became a hellscape of craters, twisted metal, and the dead and dying. The first strike by the Typhoons had achieved its objective in minutes. It had transformed a desperate retreat into an inescapable inferno, setting the stage for the other hunters in the pack to move in and ensure that nothing, and no one, would escape the slaughter. The initial rocket strike was not the culmination of the attack, it was merely the opening act of a meticulously orchestrated symphony of destruction. As the first waves of Typhoons peeled away, their ammunition expended, the sky remained dark with the next wave of the hunting pack. The brief, terrifying silence that followed the roar of their engines was instantly filled by a new, higher-pitched snarl. Now, it was the turn of the American P-47 Thunderbolts and the strafing Typhoons to enter the fray. If the rockets had been a sledgehammer, what followed was a scalpel, a relentless, low-level strafing run that turned the cratered landscape into a shooting gallery from which there was no escape. The Thunderbolts came in low, often at treetop level, their massive P and WR 2800 radial engines powering them at speeds that made them fleeting, deadly blurs. Their attack profile was different from the Typhoon's diving rocket assault. They sought out stretches of the road that were still passable, or where panicked German troops were attempting to drag damaged vehicles aside or flee on foot into the surrounding fields. The P-47's primary weapon in this hellish environment was its 8.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns. When a Thunderbolt pilot pressed his trigger, the effect was not a series of explosions, but a terrifying, linear shredding. 4 guns in each wing, their fire converging at a point several hundred yards ahead, created a hailstorm of heavy-caliber bullets that could cut a man in half or saw a truck into pieces. The strafing runs were acts of surgical precision and overwhelming firepower. A single P-47 could rake the length of a sunken lane, its .50 caliber rounds chewing through the sides of vehicles, igniting fuel tanks, and cutting down anything organic in its path. The bullets sparked and ricocheted off the cobblestones and armored plates, creating a deadly secondary shower of fragments. For the German soldiers, there was no refuge. Hiding under a truck was futile as the .50 caliber rounds pierced its thin metal skin with ease. Lying in a ditch offered little protection from the angled fire of a low-flying aircraft. The fields, which might have seemed like an escape, became killing zones where running men were clearly visible and mercilessly hunted. Amidst the thunderbolts, the remaining Typhoons, now out of rockets, joined the strafing massacre with their 20mm cannons. The effect of the cannon shells was even more gruesome than the machine gun fire. A 20mm high-explosive shell did not just penetrate, it detonated. A single shell hitting a group of soldiers could eviscerate them. A burst into the engine block of a truck would not just disable it, it would tear the engine apart. The cannons hammered the wreckage created by the rockets, ensuring that any vehicle that might have been salvageable was turned into a permanent, burning fixture of the roadblock. The chaos on the ground descended into a primal struggle for survival. The concept of a military unit ceased to exist. It was every man for himself. Officers lost all control, their commands drowned out by the endless roar of engines, the ripping sound of strafing runs, and the screams of the wounded. Horses, mad with terror, broke free from their harnesses and stampeded through the chaos, adding to the bedlam. Men abandoned their weapons, their vehicles, and sometimes their comrades, driven by a single, overpowering instinct, to get away from the road. But the road was the only landmark in the hellish landscape, and to leave it was to become utterly lost and exposed in the open country, where the fighter bombers could hunt them with even greater ease. The air itself became a weapon. The constant, deafening noise was a psychological torture that shattered nerves and broke men's wills. The concussive pressure of near misses from rockets and bombs caused internal injuries and disorientation. The smoke from hundreds of burning vehicles reduced visibility to a few yards, choking the survivors and creating an eerie, twilight atmosphere in the middle of the day. Men were killed not by direct hits, but by flying debris, a piece of shrapnel, a wheel, a fragment of their own vehicle launched by an explosion. There was no front, no rear, no safe zone. The entire area was the kill zone. The Allied pilots, following their orders to maintain continuous pressure, circled like vultures. A P-47 pilot, after making a strafing pass, would often pull up, turn, and immediately line up for another, his guns blazing until the ammunition counters showed zero. Then he would climb away, and another would take his place. It was a rotating, unending cycle of attack. For the Germans trapped below, the 15 minutes of hell felt like an eternity. Time distorted in the furnace of the attack. There was no past and no future, only the terrifying, endless present of trying to survive the next pass, the next burst of gunfire, the next explosion. The roads of the Falaise Gap had been transformed into a linear abattoir, a testament to the absolute dominance of air power and the complete helplessness of an army court in the open. The roar of engines eventually faded. The last of the Thunderbolts and Typhoons, their ammunition exhausted, their fuel running low, turned westward and disappeared, the snarl of their engines giving way to an unnerving, deafening silence. The 15 minutes of concentrated hell were over. But for those who had endured it, and for those who now moved in to survey the results, the true horror was only just beginning to reveal itself. The aftermath of the aerial onslaught was a scene so apocalyptic that it defied human comprehension, a vision of hell so stark that it would be seared into the memories of every soldier, from private to general, who witnessed it. The first and most overwhelming sensation was the smell. It was a complex, nauseating odor that hung heavy in the air for miles. It was the acrid tang of high explosives and spent cordite, mixed with the thick, greasy smell of burning diesel and gasoline. Underlying it all was the sweet, sickening stench of roasted flesh and the metallic scent of blood, a smell so potent it seemed to coat the tongue and cling to the back of the throat. This olfactory assault was often the first indication to the advancing Allied infantry that they were approaching something beyond the normal horrors of war. Then came the sight. The word, destruction, was inadequate. This was not a battlefield, it was a sprawling, open-air graveyard of steel and flesh. The roads themselves had ceased to exist as thoroughfares. They were now linear junkyards, choked with the shattered, blackened, and twisted remains of an army. Tanks lay appended, their turrets blown clean off. Trucks were reduced to skeletal frames, their tires burned away, their cargoes of ammunition, food, and personal effects scattered and incinerated. Horse-drawn wagons were splintered into kindling, the carcasses of the animals that pulled them swollen and bloated in the summer heat. The sheer density of the wreckage was staggering. In some places, the vehicles were piled 3 and 4 high, pushed off the road by bulldozers in a desperate, futile attempt to clear a path that was never opened. But it was the human cost that truly defined the landscape of absolute destruction. The dead were everywhere. They lay in the ditches, their bodies contorted in final, agonized poses. They were slumped over steering wheels, caught in the act of trying to flee. They were scattered in the fields, cut down by cannon fire as they ran for a safety that did not exist. There were so many that the advancing Allied troops often had to walk on them, there being no other path through the carnage. The scene was one of such grotesque horror that many veteran soldiers, hardened by months of combat in the bocage, were physically sickened. They spoke of it in hushed, stunned tones, struggling to find words that could do justice to the scale of the slaughter. One British officer famously remarked that it was literally possible to walk for hundreds of yards at a time, stepping on nothing but dead and decaying flesh. For the survivors, the ordeal was not over. From within the mountains of smoldering metal came faint cries and moans. Thousands of German soldiers were wounded, trapped in wrecked vehicles, or hiding in cellars and foxholes, their spirits utterly broken. They emerged not as defiant enemy soldiers, but as shattered men, their uniforms in tatters, their eyes vacant with the 1,000-yard stare of those who have stared into the abyss. They surrendered in droves, often to the first Allied soldier they saw, offering no resistance. They were the living ghosts of the 7th Army, their will to fight annihilated as completely as their equipment. The Allied medics and soldiers now faced the grim task of triage and evacuation, navigating a nightmare landscape to retrieve broken men from amidst the corpses of their comrades. The logistical and military implications of the destruction were total. The Falaise Pocket had been sealed not just by ground forces, but by this aerial interdiction. The 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army had ceased to exist as coherent fighting forces. An estimated 10,000 Germans were killed in the pocket, a significant portion of them in this one concentrated attack on the convoy. A further 50,000 were taken prisoner. The material loss was catastrophic: over 200 tanks, 1,000 artillery pieces, and 5,000 other vehicles were destroyed or abandoned. The German army in the west had been gutted. There were no reserves, no fallback position built around this corps of veterans. The road to the Seine, and then to Germany itself, was now wide open. The landscape around the villages of St. Lambert-sur-Dives and Chamboy remained a haunted place for weeks. The cleanup was a monumental task, requiring pioneers and bulldozers to simply push the wreckage into mass graves. The fields, once fertile, were poisoned by fuel, oil, and blood. The aftermath was a stark, terrifying lesson in the application of total air power. It was a demonstration that in the modern era, an army caught in the open, without air cover, could be erased from the earth in a matter of minutes. The Falaise Gap was not just a victory, it was a warning, written in fire and steel and flesh, of the destructive power that would define the remainder of the war and the conflicts of the future. The columns of black smoke rising over the Falaise Gap were more than just the funeral pyres of a convoy, they were the signal fires of a decisive end to the Battle of Normandy. The systematic destruction wrought in those 15 minutes of aerial hell, and the days of encirclement that followed, represented more than a tactical victory. It was a strategic cataclysm from which the German war machine in the West would never recover. The annihilation of the convoy and the subsequent collapse of the Falaise Pocket did not merely wound the German 7th and 5th Panzer armies, it broke their back, shattering an entire field army and irrevocably altering the course of the war in Europe. The reckoning had arrived, and its consequences were immediate, total, and far-reaching. The most palpable and immediate effect was the sheer, quantifiable loss of men and material. The numbers were staggering. Within the pocket, an estimated 10,000 German soldiers lay dead, with a significant percentage of them perishing in the concentrated slaughter of the convoy attacks. A further 50,000, including many of the most experienced junior officers and NCOs, marched into captivity. These were not fresh recruits, they were the battle-hardened core of the Wehrmacht in France, veterans of the brutal fighting in the Bocage who possessed the institutional knowledge and combat skill that could not be quickly replaced. Their loss created a vacuum of expertise that would cripple German defensive capabilities for the remainder of the war. Alongside this human tragedy was the material catastrophe. The Allies captured or destroyed over 200 tanks, 1,000 artillery pieces, and some 5,000 assorted vehicles, trucks, half-tracks, staff cars, and prime movers. An army is a system, and this system had its logistics, its mobility, and its heavy firepower utterly eviscerated. The remnants that escaped eastward did so largely on foot, abandoning their heavy equipment and fleeing in disorganized, demoralized bands. The psychological impact of the Falaise disaster was, if anything, even more profound than the physical losses. For the German soldier, the myth of the Wunderwaffe, the wonder weapon, and the invincibility of the Wehrmacht had been shattered on the plains of France. The experience of being helplessly hunted from the air, trapped like animals in a closing vice, created a deep-seated trauma known as Jaboterra, fighter bomber terror. From this point forward, the mere sound of an Allied aircraft engine could trigger panic and paralyze movement. Morale, which had held firm through years of war, collapsed. The will to fight, so carefully cultivated by the Nazi regime, was replaced by a desperate will to survive. Soldiers began to think not of victory, but of simply living long enough to surrender to the Western Allies rather than the Soviets. This breakdown in morale cascaded up the chain of command. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluger, commander of German forces in the West, committed suicide shortly after the battle, a stark testament to the magnitude of the defeat and the despair it engendered in the German high command. Strategically, the victory at Falaise flung open the gates to France. With the primary German field army in Normandy annihilated, there was no cohesive force left to oppose the Allied advance. The German front was not just bent, it was broken. General George S. Patton's Third Army, which had been straining at the leash, now exploded eastward in a breathtaking race across France. The pursuit was on. The Allies liberated Paris on August 25, just days after the pocket was sealed. They did not stop. They crossed the Seine, then the Meuse, advancing at a pace that mirrored the German blitzkrieg of 1940. The German high command, reeling from the disaster, had no reserves to plug the gaping hole in their lines. They could only attempt desperate, piecemeal defenses that were effortlessly brushed aside by the triumphant Allied juggernaut. The war of position in Normandy was over, the war of movement, which would carry the Allies to the borders of Germany itself, had begun. The Falaise Gap also stands as the ultimate validation of Allied air-ground coordination and the doctrine of tactical air power. It was the perfect execution of a strategy of interdiction. The Allied air forces did not just support the ground troops, they became the primary instrument of destruction, delivering a killing blow that the ground forces alone could not have administered with such finality and speed. The battle proved that complete air superiority was not merely an advantage, it was a decisive, war-winning weapon. It allowed the Allies to see the enemy's movements, shape the battlefield, and then systematically dismantle the enemy's forces from the air. The lessons learned at Falaise, the importance of photo reconnaissance, the flexibility of fighter bombers, the devastating effect of concentrated air power on a trapped force, would be applied relentlessly for the rest of the war, from the Battle of the Bulge to the final push across the Rhine. In the grand tapestry of World War II, the Falaise Pocket represents the true end of the beginning in the West. It was the death knell for any realistic German hope of stabilizing the front in France. The ambitious, pre-invasion German strategy of throwing the Allies back into the sea was now a pathetic fantasy. The question was no longer if Germany would be defeated, but when. The backbone of their army in the West had been snapped, and the road to the fatherland lay open. The 15 minutes of hell endured by the convoy on the roads to St. Lambert were not an isolated incident of violence, they were the concentrated essence of a larger, strategic triumph. They were the moment the Allied hammer fell with final, crushing force, breaking an army and, in doing so, shortening the war and altering the destiny of a continent.